Hey Artners, today we are unboxing and swatching the Artibox watercolor kit. These are from Singapore, Artibox International, and I purchased this on Amazon to check it out with you guys today. This is a 48 pan palette, and it also comes with a pad of watercolor paper, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what it has to offer. All right, so y'all voted for it. Today we're taking a look at the Artibox watercolor set. So these are produced by Singapore Artibox International Pte Limited. We have a solid watercolor pack. They did not mark which set. Here we go. So we're taking a look at the iron 48 piece set. So this was purchased on Amazon. It was $39.19. This is part of my student grade Showdown. So if you're on the market for great affordable watercolors, hopefully I've got something for you guys. I'll link that playlist down in the description below. And of course, this is brought to you guys thanks to the generosity of my amazing patrons on Patreon, the only sponsors this channel has. So as I said, this was purchased on Amazon. It is the 48 assorted vibrant colors, includes a brush and a 12 watercolor paper sheet. And we've reviewed a few of these kind of sets that come with the paper, and generally I haven't been too impressed. So the Amazon listing says that the paint is made of high quality pigments that allows colors to be more vibrant, transparent, and pure, long lasting. Artibox refers to this as a professional watercolor set. It also claims that it can meet the needs of art students and artists, and it claims the included watercolor paper is also professional grade, so we are definitely going to be taking a look at that today. It is available in plastic and metal palettes in 24, 36, and 48 half pan sets, and this box arrived a little bit dinged up. It's probably more Amazon's fault than Artibox's fault. There isn't a lot of information about Artibox online. I've tried Googling it. I will keep trying throughout the duration of this review, but rather than wait any longer, let's go ahead and unbox it. So here we have, ooh, that's a hefty chonker right there. We have our 48 professional solid watercolor set by Artibox. To dream, to live, to create. They are non-toxic half pans with reusable paint, whatever that means, in a sturdy tin box. And like I said, it's pretty heavy. And they also offer us some essential skills to improve your watercolors, like explore dry versus wet, work from dark to light, layered and activated, wet on wet salt, wet on wet, and blotting lifting. Speaking of, if you guys are looking for some great basic watercolor tutorials or even something more advanced, I've got you covered every single step of the way. I am a watercolor illustrator and watercolor comic artist. I paint the comics 7-inch Kara, which you guys can check out at 7inchkara.com. And just to give you guys kind of an idea of where I'm coming from when I'm reviewing these sort of art supplies, not only am I a watercolor comic artist, but I am a sometimes art educator. I teach watercolors, alcohol markers, and comics, both online and off. So when I'm reviewing watercolors, I'm looking at it through the lens of a watercolor comic artist, somebody who needs to paint a lot of panels on a page, a lot of tiny faces on a page, who does not need her watercolors to turn to mud, but also as an art educator, somebody who is constantly asked about affordable art supplies. And while I would love to be able to recommend that people just buy the nice, expensive ones, that is often not a reality for a lot of people. So it is good to have a few student grade watercolors in my back pocket that I can recommend. So during this review, during this unbox and swatch, and this is a two-part, please stay tuned, stay subscribed for the field test that's going to be coming up later when I actually put these things through the full illustration paces. But anyway, that's the lens I'm looking at when I'm reviewing watercolors and art supplies. So you know, if you've seen this review from someone else, maybe we're coming at it from, you know, different angles. They could be a color for relaxation sort of person. They could be a crafter. They could be a fine artist. We've all got something interesting and valid to say that could be completely different from one another. So if your needs coincide with mine, you are in the right place, and hopefully you guys will stick around. So anyway, I do have more watercolor tutorials here on the channel where I walk you guys through these sort of things step by step. I also do live streams from time to time, so I'm here to have your back. They suggest that you store it at room temperature, avoiding direct sun exposure. The package includes 48 solid watercolor and 1 brush. They are half pans. The image shown here is indicative only. The actual product might differ. Then what is it indicative of? It is a choking hazard, so it is not suitable for 0 to 3 sad onions. And it is produced by Singapore Artibox International Pte Ltd, 10 Anson Road, number 27 through 15, International Plaza, Singapore. So that is all the info on this, and it's all in English. Thank you. Then we also have our 12 sheets cold press watercolor pad. So it does not say whether or not it is cotton rag or cellulose, but there are a few clues. So up here we have an FSC logo, and 7-inch Cara Volume 2 happens to have the same logo, which means this product was made from sustainably forested trees, so it's probably cellulose, being wood pulp. We also have the acid-free down here. That is also a strong indication of it being cellulose. It is size A4, 300 GM, so that's about 140 pounds, so a little bit heavier than cardstock, and it's an 11 by 0.7 by 8.3 pad, and it comes, it's just a pad of paper. It's not an envelope. It is just a pad of paper. So I will go ahead and unwrap these, unplastify them for you guys. So just your very typical plastic bag, no branding, nothing that makes it really special. That's fine with me. Oh, is it even a pad? Oh no. So y'all, let me see if I can get it so you guys can see it. Y'all have to let me know if you can actually see the texture. You can see the shadow of my phone. I am working on improving my lighting in here, but that's a work in progress. So this is not my own preferred watercolor paper texture. This is like that linen texture. Some artists really like it and can paint beautiful things on it. I don't really like it, and I cannot paint beautiful things on this particular texture. It's just a little too regular for me. So that's a personal preference on my part. But I'm already not loving the paper. But we'll take a look at that a little bit later on. So our Artibox 48 Professional Solid Watercolors is plastic wrapped, shrink wrapped in fact. But I have an opening here where I think I can peel it open. All right, that was much tougher to get out of that plastic wrap than I really anticipated. Had to get an assist from a pair of scissors. So you guys ready to check out our sturdy tin box? I know I am. So inside our unbranded metal tin, like there is nothing on this tin to indicate Artibox or Singapore. It's even worse than the Etcher watercolors in that regard. I mean, it's a very basic black tin. Now it does it does have your very standard. I always think this thing is funny because it's like, it's just going to eat into your hand, especially as heavy as this palette is. So inside we have 4 mixing wells. We also have our watercolor information, which is great. It makes it super handy. I really appreciate this. I mean, we have our pigment info, we have our series info, we have our color numbers, we have our light fast info, we have our transparency info. I really appreciate that. It makes it so, oh look, they even explain, like, look, PW, pigment white, PY, pigment yellow. Like, I'm not making fun of it. That makes this way more accessible, that it's all right here. So it does say it's not suitable for young children, and it says it is non-toxic, and it's made in the People's Republic of China. I appreciate that all that information is actually right there, because when I'm reviewing these cheaper student grade sets, pigment information, what's that? Now, I have mixed feelings. On one hand, I'm really happy that these half pans did not come pre-wrapped. That's less waste. I appreciate that. The half pans themselves have these weird little divots, so they're kind of custom half pans. They've already got a little bit of a chalky look to them, but what is concerning to me, I don't know if you guys can see this. I don't know if there's like a way I can get it to focus, but they are covered in like a white dust or these white specks, or maybe it's paper. I have no idea what it is, but that's a little concerning to me. I mean, it came a long way to be here today, so can't expect it to be 100% not. Wait a minute, I've reviewed a bunch of watercolors that did not arrive all dusty like this. So we have our 48 watercolors here. We also have our included brush. If you have been watching the student grade Showdown for a while now, you guys know water brushes are great for some artists. They just don't really do it for me. So I will take a look at this water brush. But they're pretty, all these inexpensive. Ooh, okay. Well, we've already got some bristles that are like all the way bent out of shape. So that's kind of a downside. But other than that, I was going to say it's a pretty standard water brush, not as thin a plastic as some of the ones I've reviewed. It also has this thing, which is a stopper. Most of the time it's a stopper. This instance it might not be. Yeah, it's a stopper. And that way you could carry the cap and the water container itself separate. There is a bit of a crack here in the collar though, so I don't think it would really be that waterproof. I'm not going to review this brush because it's seen better days already. But they do include a water brush. I appreciate when these companies include brushes, even the crummier brushes, because it does mean that people can get started quicker. So with these kits, that's something that I have come to appreciate, is even if I don't like the paper, even if the paper is terrible paper, at least you could theoretically get started that day. The big thing I want to hammer home though is the papers are usually terrible, and you'll be a lot happier painting on something like Canson XL. So if you're watching this review thinking about giving this kit as a gift, consider also giving a pad a Canson XL. You can find it at Walmart. It's the blue pads. It's like $10. It's a fine cellulose watercolor paper. Not the best, but a very good budget paper. So our 48 half pans want to, theoretically they could come out, but I think there is a slight manufacturer's defect in my palette, because there we go. All right, we got it now. All right, yay. These are very obviously, at least in my opinion, extruded watercolors rather than poured. So extruded is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different thing. It's just a different manufacturing process than poured. I tend to prefer poured watercolors because I find they're a little quicker to activate. Extruded ones tend to be a little harder to activate. They're not bad. They're just, oh, and they were glued in with a little bit of gum arabic. Good for you. All right. I am actually seeing a lot of things about this Artibox palette that I don't mind. So the only real way we're gonna know if this palette is any good at all, it's in the title of the video, we're gonna swatch it. And today we are gonna be swatching on two papers. We're gonna be swatching on the included Artibox paper, and we're gonna be swatching on my standard, the Blick Studio Cotton Rag Watercolor block. Et voila! Here is our watercolor block. It is a cotton rag watercolor block. So cotton rag would usually be a more premium, a nicer watercolor paper. It can be a bit pricey though, so a lot of people do prefer to start with cellulose as it is a little more accessible and a little bit more affordable. But I find the Blick Studio cotton rag paper to be a great affordable cotton rag watercolor paper. I also happen to really like the Stonehenge Aqua watercolor paper, and that's gonna be what I use for my field test. So two very affordable, accessible watercolor papers that I hope you guys will try out. I think I have reviews for both of them here on the channel. Basically though, with our swatches, for right now, we are going to swatch all 48 colors. I'm gonna do 4 rows, so it's gonna be like 12 colors per row. And we're gonna be looking at color vibrancy, how quickly these paints activate. We're gonna be looking at granulation. We're gonna be looking for opacity and muddiness, the possible signs that point to the inclusion of optical brighteners, which I've talked about so much during the student grade showdown. So quick TLDR, they're not inherently the worst thing ever. They're not necessarily bad. They do make the colors in your half pans just pop a little bit more than they normally would if they weren't included. A very common one is the inclusion of PW6. A little bit makes the colors kind of pop in a half pan form, which makes them more appealing to customers who are buying them. However, too much can make them chalky, it can make them muddy, it can pollute the water very quickly, and it can just generally be used as a way to very cheaply extend those somewhat expensive watercolor pigments. So not the worst thing ever, but you don't want to see, it's like, you know, candy, you know, like a little bit is fine, a little bit is great, a lot is not really such a good thing. So we are going to be looking for optical brighteners today. We are also going to check out how these kind of wash out. Do they just completely turn to nothing when we add water? And then we're going to be doing a lift test a little bit later on. I'm also going to do some color mixing in this video so we can see how well, even though we have 48 colors to choose from, we've got a lot of colors on our hands, you still want to see if you can mix that exact specific special shade that you want to mix. That's actually really important for me with my watercolor comic work and with my illustration. So that's something I always test. And then we're gonna do my new wet into wet test where we dump a bunch of paint and pigment on cotton rag watercolor paper and we see how well those particles just disperse. And that is brought to you guys thanks to the utter failure that the Mia watercolor palette, that diamond palette that they released, it and I are not friends. And I've learned some valuable lessons from fighting with it that I now apply to my future unbox and swatches. So let's go ahead, let's get our paper marked up. I'm gonna use a Mexp alcohol marker because frankly, that's what I've got. And theoretically, the watercolors aren't going to activate it and it's not going to cause a resist, which would make it harder to judge the opacity of these colors. Usually I'd prefer to use a Copic marker for this because the Mexp has a tendency to react, but we just moved and I don't know where my Copics are. So we're going to be using the Mexp today for that. And let's go ahead and start swatching these watercolors. So I'm going to start on the Blick Studio watercolor paper and then move on to the Artibox cellulose paper. I'm going to share the pigment information for this set down in the description below in the show notes, but the colors in this set are titanium white, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow pale hue, Indian yellow gamboge hue, flesh tint, cadmium orange hue, cadmium red pale hue, cadmium red hue, cadmium red deep hue, alizarin crimson hue, permanent rose, rose madder, opera rose, quinacridone violet, permanent violet, perylene violet, permanent mauve, permanent violet blue, dioxine purple, ultramarine blue, ultramarine violet, phthalo yellow green, permanent green LT, hooker green light, permanent green, phthalo green, Prussian green, phthalo turquoise, phthalo blue, cobalt blue hue, cerulean blue hue, cobalt turquoise light, sap green, serpentine genuine, olive green, yellow ochre, raw sienna, quinacridone gold, Indian red, burnt umber, gray, Payne's gray, and ivory black. And keep in mind, I'm going to have the series info, the light fast info, the pigment info, and the transparency spelled out for you guys in the description below. Well, in the show notes linked in the description below. All right, friends, I've got bad news for yous. So usually when we spray watercolors and they absorb some of the water, if you start seeing these lighter patches on your watercolors, that's a good sign that they might include a lot of optical brighteners. So we still gotta swatch them to know for sure, but that is one of the red flags. So one of the things that I really noticed with this set is that these seem to muddy the water really fast, and you guys will see that in a minute because in between the rows I'm going to show you guys what the rinse water looks like. So there's definitely some optical brighteners in here, but there are also several intentionally opaque colors, and that's perfectly normal for more opaque colors to kind of muddy the water quicker, like many of the yellows, oranges, and the two flesh tints. The paints do glob up on the brush, but they also activate fast, and they seem to have a decent color payoff. These really remind me though of the Coolbank watercolors or the Simi Art watercolors, partially for the color selection, but also just how some of these colors handle. The included color map looks like it photographed kind of dark, so I recommend you rely on your own swatches during color selection. So I would say make your own swatch map. And so far, the colors swatch pretty vibrant. There are a couple that do seem to dry desaturated, but so far, not so bad. However, the higher price point puts them in competition with Rosa Galleria, Mungyo, Mei Liang, and Superior watercolors. And while the Mungyo left a lot to be desired, the other three are great. Granulation isn't really noticeable in these swatches. The ultramarine might have a smidge, as might the black, but not a whole lot. Hopefully the wet to wet test will reveal more. So one area where we would typically look for more granulation is with the ultramarine blues and with some of the earth pigment, and I'm really not seeing much granulation with them. Also, some of the earth pigments contain multiple pigments in there, so that's definitely a red flag for me. So while this is drying, we're going to go ahead and do our swatches on the included Artibox paper. Had to grab it for you guys. Do I have high hopes for this paper? No. But I am trying to make it a point to review the included papers and not just, toss them aside and say they're not going to work for us. So I was able to sort of find a little more information out about Artibox, but it was really just like their street address, things like that. So if you are super curious, I can have that linked in the show notes, but I don't really think it's worth going into because it's not really information about like whether they have a larger product line or anything like that, which is kind of disappointing. Oh, we are so close to being able to divide this up into fourths, but we cannot. Oh, well, that's okay. So we're using the Artibox paper now. Generally with these kind of kit reviews, I do try to review the paper, at least in some capacity, even if I'm not really fond of it. And water just seems to sit on the surface of this paper, and duh, Becca, it is a cellulose. So I'm gonna turn on my dehumidifier and hopefully that'll let us speed things up a little bit. And this paper just isn't doing it for me. I've never been big on cold press papers with like the regular linen style pattern. I personally find it distracting, and the paper itself is buckling and curving just from this test. On this paper, you can't really do wet into wet. Either the paper is really wet or it's dry, which is common with cellulose papers. The water mostly just sits on top of the paper rather than soaking in and getting trapped into the fibers. It's better than some of the included papers I reviewed, like the Cool Pink and the cheaper Giorgione, but I would recommend picking up a pad of Canson XL watercolor paper if you want to paint on a less expensive, more accessible paper. And you can get Canson watercolor paper just about everywhere. I don't have any kind of relationship or sponsorship with them. I've worked with Canson XL for a long time, and while it isn't, you know, a super high quality watercolor paper, it's really not bad at all for a cellulose paper, and you can get it just about everywhere, both in sketchbook form and in pad form. So it's just a really accessible paper. So I have swatched on both papers, and I've gone through the pigment list and the light fast information, and I have some concerns that I just kind of wanted to talk to you guys about. So I cellulose papers and I are starting to drift apart. I'll probably still continue to use Canson Montval for 7-inch Cara because painting a multi-hundred page watercolor comic gets expensive, and you gotta find ways to, you know, get the best quality product without totally breaking the bank, and the paper is a good way to do that. And plus, Montval has some properties that make it uniquely useful. And I just remembered I forgot to turn off the dehumidifier, so I apologize for that noise, but frankly it's pretty useful tonight since we're reviewing watercolors. So, you know, this paper already had some strikes going against it, just some areas where I'm kind of biased. It's better than some of the pack-in watercolor papers that I reviewed, like the Cool Bank and the cheaper Giorgione paper. I have never been a fan of this regular texture, but some people do like it, so I'll admit that bias. But honestly, I think Canson XL watercolor paper is a better paper than this paper. And if you're looking for a very cheap watercolor paper that you'll probably like better, you guys should check that out. It's sold almost everywhere. So the colors on this paper, I think their cellulose paper just doesn't really do their colors justice. Not that this is the best watercolors I've ever reviewed or anything like that, but just the way the color is reflected, it's a little more subtle, a little more classy on this paper. So here is my area of concern. If we trust what this says here, there's some good stuff in here. Like, for example, they're talking about Serpentine Genuine. Now, having, used Daniel Smith watercolors for a while, Serpentine Genuine is a really popular color, and it's a granulating color. It's made from serpentine, which is a mineral. There's no pigment info listed, which I could go dig up my Daniel Smith Serpentine Green and just get real nitpicky, but it's still packed away, so I'm not going to do that. I don't think, this right here does look like it would be that color, but it's like sap green. It's a very bright, or a spring green. It's a very bright green. I just don't think this is serpentine green, but maybe I'm wrong. And then there's also a quin gold hue, which is a little unusual because quins are a little less expensive. Now there are a few other quins in here, like there's a quinacridone violet, and it's not a hue. And I'm actually not complaining about the fact that they're using hues, because hues are really common with student grade watercolors. It's not really a problem with that. They're just a cheaper alternative to the original pigment. And there's several colors that if they were using the real deal, it would be toxic. For example, cadmium orange hue, cadmium red pale hue, etc. So I can understand some of those, or like cobalt blue hue. I can understand some of those. But then there's some where I'm like, but why? Like gamboge, I didn't think gamboge was particularly expensive or toxic, but you guys let me. So I don't know. There's just some areas that are a little red flaggy for me, but maybe I'm just overthinking it. So there's also a lot of semi-opaque colors in this set and downright opaque colors in this set. I'm not necessarily seeing that opacity reflected in either of the swatch tests, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't become apparent when actually using the colors in a watercolor illustration. That's usually why I do a field test to like really see how the watercolors handle in a real world situation. So next, I am going to do the color mixing test, and for that test, we're done. We're done. I don't like that paper. We're done with the Artibox paper. We're gonna focus on the cotton rag paper. Because honestly, cotton rag gives these paints the best chance possible. So in my opinion, it makes for the fairest review because I'm giving them their best chance to shine. So with the color mixing test, I'm going to do two types of mixing. We're going to do atomic mixing, where we take two colors, smash them together to make a third. And we're going to do optical mixing, where we create a grid of color and we're basically layering one color on top of the other after the first one is dried to see if it creates a secondary color. And that's where the opacity is probably really going to start becoming quite noticeable. I'm going to set up the optical mixing first. That'll give it a chance to dry while we do our atomic mixing. It was pretty easy for me to find the primaries in this set, although I was kind of also relying on the swatches that I just made. So I'd really recommend you go ahead and make a color map for this set. It's just going to be easier to work with. And since this set actually has a mixing surface included in, I'm going to go ahead and use that. So for the atomic set, I found it was fairly easy to mix oranges, greens, and a decent purple, but colors seem a lot less saturated than their pre-mixed counterparts. The Payne's gray I mixed is less impressive, so this is kind of a red flag for me. These aren't necessarily terrible mixers, but a field test will really reveal any hidden issues. So for the optical test, which is going to follow in just a second, some lifting did occur. I'm not sure if I just didn't wait long enough for the first layer to dry, but I do have the dehumidifier on, and there's some muddiness to the glazes. So this is definitely something you're going to want to keep an eye out for if you are using these watercolors for layered watercolor illustrations. Now I am going to put them through a full illustration field test, and that's going to reveal more problems, I'm sure. So hopefully you guys will keep an eye out for that and look forward to it. You can find out when that happens by clicking that subscribe button and the bell notification, and YouTube will let you know when the field test is finally ready. found that color mixing test a little bit disappointing. So next we're gonna do the lift test, and that's pretty straightforward. So usually I like to use a synthetic flat for this. Today I'm using a silver black velvet flat. I've got a cup of clean water, and I also have a paper towel, and I'm really just testing to see how easily these colors lift up or if they're particularly staining. Now, what you want to see with decent watercolors is you actually want to see a mix. Some colors should be a little bit more staining if the particles are finer. Some should be a little bit more lifting if the granulation is more apparent and is larger. So it really should vary. It shouldn't just be completely uniform across the board. One thing I have noticed though is that with student grade watercolors that include a lot of optical brighteners, they tend to be a lot more lifting. So we're going to keep an eye out for that while we do our lift test. So with the lift test, I noticed that everything lifts almost the same amount, but none of it is too lifting. It's pretty staining. This makes it challenging to tell how these will do in a field test. It seems like the color is stuck pretty well to the paper, which is not always a good thing. Really, I was hoping to see more variation in how these watercolors lift. So remember how we talked about red flags earlier, how they're not necessarily a bad thing, but they sure indicate that there might be something to keep an eye out for? Well, these all kind of lift about the same amount, but they're not particularly lifting. So I'm actually getting kind of mixed signals here. Now remember earlier I said that lifting is not necessarily a bad thing. Some particles are just going to be more prone to lifting and some are going to be more prone to staining. So what this could mean is that the pigments are a little bit more finely ground. But if you go too far with that, the colors change. So a great example of that would be like white fountain pen ink. You're never going to get a truly white fountain pen ink. You're going to get like kind of a milky white designed to mix with other colors to add some opacity white, but you're never going to get like a white gel pen white with fountain pen because they just can't grind those white particles fine enough and they still stay white. So I'm not sure what the tolerances are for that regarding watercolor. It's not like we're trying to get through a fountain pen here, but I do know that if you get those particles too fine, they're no longer going to reflect light the same way and they're not going to be the same colors. So in this instance, I don't know. It could always be a combination of particle size and binder. And with these student grade watercolors, they're not particularly quick to disclose what binders they're using. A pretty typical one would be gum arabic, but we've also encountered honey and we've even encountered dextrin. So, and we've even encountered glycerin. I can't forget that. Never forget that. So, the binder can really play a big difference in how your watercolors handle, and Artibox is not exactly forthcoming with the personal information at any point. So this is just something for me to kind of keep an eye out for, to be aware of when we're doing our field test. So I have one more test, and then we're going to compare the Artibox watercolors to some, I think, comparable watercolors. So next, we're going to do the wet into wet test. So for this, we're going to use our cotton rag Dick Blick watercolor paper again. This one is actually pretty simple. We're just going to saturate the paper with water and then saturate the paper with color, let it dry, and basically see what it tells us. Are we going to see granulation? Are we going to see significant color fading? Are we going to see colors that are brilliant in mass tone but dissipate into basically nothing? We've seen all of that in prior wet into wet tests, and this is a really good way to get an idea for how these paints are going to handle. So I'm starting by completely saturating my cotton rag watercolor paper. I want to make sure the whole thing has plenty of water so the pigments can diffuse. And these really don't granulate out that much in the wet into wet test. I was really hoping to see more granulation, especially since I'm working on a cotton rag cold pressed watercolor paper. There's plenty of tooth for it to actually kind of granulate out into. The ultramarine blue kind of does, and the cerulean blue hue does a bit, but otherwise everything feels like it's kind of the same granulation, and it also dries a bit muted. I also noticed that it takes a lot of paint to get any kind of real saturation, which is an ongoing trend with a lot of these Chinese student grade watercolors, like with the Cool Bank set or the Simi Art set or the Xylee W set. I mean, this is from Singapore, so it's not really Chinese, but there just tends to be a lot of desaturation going on, and we lose a lot of color as it dries. The wet into wet test is a little bit like reading tea leaves. It doesn't really promise to tell the future, but sometimes it feels like it can. In this instance, the tea leaves are hard to read. I can see a little granulation here, but not necessarily as much as I really would have wanted to see, considering I introduced several opaque colors as we kind of played around with these colors. I'm also kind of disappointed that the colors dry and they're just not nearly as assertive as they were when they were wet, and this is becoming a common theme in these student grade Showdown watercolor reviews. I'm not surprised, but I am a little bit disappointed by it. But honestly, in the end, this only tells us maybe what we could expect. The field test is what's going to really tell me whether or not this palette is worthwhile. And I know that feels like a cop-out. I feel like it's kind of a cop-out. I feel guilty for not having anything more definitive for you guys. But this one is kind of riding that middle line for me right now. It's not terrible, but it's not that good. And some of the other watercolor palettes we're going to talk about in a minute cost less or approximately the same. They're in the same ballpark, and I felt like they handled a lot better. But one of them, the Shapiro Farben set, it really did not impress me during its unbox and swatch, and it wasn't until the field test where I really developed an appreciation for it. So that's why I'm being kind of cagey and wishy-washy about this. Is I know that in the past I've had unbox and swatches seem really promising, like the Mia field test, or I'm sorry, the Mia unbox and swatch, and then it just totally fell apart during the field test. Or it really seemed like it just wasn't going to be that great a palette, but then I go ahead and I field test it and I can find a lot that I really like about it. So that's why the field test is so important. Testing out watercolors under a real world circumstance. It's a real illustration on real cotton rag watercolor paper, and frankly I honestly really want it to work, so I'm going to use whatever tools, whatever problem solving skills I have to make the most out of the watercolors to make them work. And in the end, if it still doesn't work after I've given it my best, then I can say, no, skip this one. But until we do that field test, all I can do is make some pretty decent guesses as to whether or not I enjoyed this palette and whether or not you guys would enjoy this palette. But right now, the biggest hang up for me is this price point. It was around $35. There are a lot of great palettes for around $35. So here are some of the watercolors I thought were comparable or similar to the Artibox solid watercolors. A few of these are 48-piece sets like the Mungyo, and I actually need to grab the Giorgione, but some of them are actually much smaller sets. All right, so now I've also got the Giorgione handy. So the Artibox watercolors are about $31. I'm just scrolling up to grab that price one more time. I'm sorry, they are $35.19 on Amazon. So that would put them in competition. That would put them at the same price point as the Rosa Gallery and the Etcher and the Mungyo, it would also put them at the same price point as the Shapiro Farben, and it would make them a little bit more expensive than the Superior Folding Palette or the Giorgione watercolors. And this isn't like everything I've been reviewing. These are just the most comparable, the most similar watercolors that we can compare and talk about them. So I don't actually have the swatch sheets for the Shapiro Farben and the Superior handy. I'm going to include some snippets from their field test videos, and that way we can kind of talk about them a bit more in depth. But all of the ones on this table are watercolors that I have reviewed, so there are full unbox and swatch reviews available if you're interested in this palette but you kind of want to compare. So the Artibox, when compared side by side in terms of color and performance against some of these other watercolors, I find that it has some pretty egregious shortcomings. So we're gonna grab what I would recommend over the Artibox, the Rosa Gallery watercolors. I really like these. I'm really looking forward to the unbox and swatch. And then one of you guys generously commented that these are actually have some history with the White Nights and Yarka watercolors. So that might explain why the quality is so good on these. But these are around $36. You do only get 21 colors rather than 48. So you're not getting as many, but these are full pans and they are hand poured. And the color in these is just, beautiful. They perform the way I would want them to perform. There's some beautiful granulation. They just have that watercolor feel, and I'm able to mix colors easily and get really beautiful, vibrant mixes, which is definitely what I'm looking for when it comes to watercolors. I'm really excited about these. The metal palettes are pretty similar, to be honest. So here is the Artibox palette. Here is the Rosa palette. They're both tin palettes. They both have a ring on the back. They both have multiple mixing surfaces. They're really pretty similar. The Rosa palette is also designed. You could do 48 half pans in this palette, so very similar to the Artibox palette. The difference is this one didn't come with a water brush, but frankly, I really wasn't that impressed with the water brush that they included. I've put it back in here, but I'm gonna end up tossing it because it's got holes in the collar where it can leak. So I would recommend the Rosa Gallery watercolors over the Artibox watercolors, even though they don't come with quite as much stuff as the Artibox. They don't come with paper and they don't come with a water brush. I would also compare the Artibox watercolors to the Etcher watercolors. Now, the Etcher watercolor half pan set, you get 24 colors. They're decent quality watercolors. I think they're overpriced for what they are. I want to say they're in the $45 category, so they're actually kind of expensive for student grade watercolors, especially now when we have so much competition. But they perform quite well. The colors are pretty clean. I would say these are maybe a little bit nicer than Cotman. This is definitely a white label product, but I don't know who they're buying their watercolors from. They do admit that they are sourcing their watercolors from other manufacturers. They just don't say who that other manufacturer is, so that's a little bit frustrating for me. But it is a very, very similar metal palette, just smaller. This would be the, I want to say 24 half pan palette. The presentation's much nicer than the Artibox, much more, giftable if that's what you're interested in. I'm not necessarily so interested in presentation over performance. And I do think that the presentation kind of causes a price increase with the Etcher watercolors. So while they're not bad, I think they're kind of overpriced for what they are. And I think there are, more affordable, similar options to this. But here is the wet into wet test. So we're getting, I think, a bit more saturation, definitely more granulation than with the Artibox watercolors. And then here are the swatches. Sorry, it's hard to juggle when you've got so many palettes on the table, but isn't that a good thing? So 48 set, 24 set. I'm able to mix more saturated, vibrant mixes with the Etcher watercolors than I was with the Artibox. As I'm kind of comparing the two, I'm really seeing that the Artibox, they're really kind of pale and desaturated compared to some of these other watercolors. Now, would I recommend the Etcher set over the Artibox set? No, they're much more expensive. I wouldn't necessarily recommend either of these two sets as we're kind of walking through this. So also somewhat similar to the Artibox set is the blue Giorgione palette. So this is from that two-way review where I reviewed both the pink palette, the very cheap pink palette, and the blue palette. This is about $14. Now, the Artibox does seem to perform quite a bit better than the Giorgione. The colors are actually more saturated. The Giorgione watercolors are really pretty desaturated. And with both, my mixes are just really kind of desaturated and not particularly impressive. So I would say the Artibox is probably a little bit better than the Giorgione, but it's also twice the price, plus some change of the Giorgione. So the Giorgione came with a lot of stuff. It comes in a blue tint palette. This one is larger than the Artibox palette. This is also a custom palette. They've got embossing and, well, that would be embossing and screening on the front. It has a different style of holder for this, and this is actually larger than 48 pans, I want to say. No, now I'm looking at it, it is 48 pans. It just looks like more. I don't know why. It also came with paper, and the included cellulose watercolor paper really wasn't that bad. It comes with a water brush, and it also comes with a synthetic traditional watercolor brush. So I would say, oh goodness, this is so much heavier than this one too. And I mean, this tray adds some weight, but it's like significantly heavier than the Giorgione palette. But I would say between these two, the Artibox watercolors are better quality than the Giorgione watercolors, but it's also, I'm going to keep going back to this point where $35, that kind of puts it in a different price bracket, and it's competing against some of the bigger dogs. With the Giorgione palette, it's so cheap, it's almost like, well, you can get it and you can paint some stuff with it, and then when you're done with it, you know, you can upgrade. It's not really that expensive. But with the Artibox and these more expensive student grade palettes, this becomes kind of an investment that you really want to be able to use for a while, and I'm not so sure that this is really going to give you what you need. I do think in the wet into wet test though, the Artibox wins in that the colors do dry a bit more saturated than the Giorgione watercolors dried. They dried really very desaturated, and they were pretty disappointing. So then we have the Mungyo watercolor. So this is a Korean watercolor brand. And as I mentioned in the unboxing swatch for these, you're probably pretty familiar with these and might not realize it because Mungyo is white labeled by other companies. So these palettes look very similar. The Mungyo palette does have some screening on it, but these are very similar watercolor palettes. And I would actually say the Artibox one is a little heavier, which I don't necessarily understand why. So both of these are 48 half pan. No, I think the Mungyo might have a few more. Let me check. Not 48. It has some metallics up here, and then the rest are fairly standard colors. My big problem with the Mungyo is that I think they're really kind of gritty. And I don't mean they granulate, I mean there is actual grit in the paint. And as somebody who paints teeny tiny faces, grittiness is not a good thing. So I do need to field test these, and hopefully I'll change my mind. I'll be singing a different tune. But I think the Mungyo, which are at a very similar price point to the Artibox, even though they don't come with the paper and they don't come with the water brush, I think the Mungyo are probably a little bit higher quality watercolor paints. There's definitely more saturation here. The colors, the mixed colors are a little bit brighter. I did have some reactivation issues, which, you know, that happens sometimes even with the best of paints. That's not an end all be all, it's just a red flag. And they are all fairly staining, but also like the Artibox, it's not necessarily all to the same degree. But I would say side by side, I think the Mungyo are probably going to be a better choice than the Artibox watercolors. But you know, the true proof is really in the field test. It's actually creating a watercolor illustration and spending some real time with these paints. So I have two more watercolor palettes that I think are pretty comparable. We have the, unfortunately I don't have the swatches for these, but I do have the field test, so I'm gonna include those for you guys. We have the Superior 58 watercolors, and Superior is always doing these really kind of weird, innovative things. I've reviewed a few Superior products here on the channel, and even when the format doesn't work for me, like with that weird fan palette, I'm just always impressed with their innovation and their willingness to kind of try different things and think outside the box. Because when you've reviewed 6 palettes that all basically look like this, something that looks like this is really pretty refreshing. And I found that I really like these paints. I had a lot of fun with these in the field test, so I'm going to include that right here for you guys so you guys can kind of check that out. So here are a few clips from the Superior watercolor palette field test, and I was really impressed by how well these handle wet into wet. These punch well above their pay grade, and while the Mei Liang pigments are way up there in terms of affordable and accessible watercolor palettes that I can happily recommend to you guys, this is just maybe even one notch below. It might even just be tied. I really like this palette, and I hope you guys will check out the unbox and swatch and the field test to learn more about it. But this is kind of what I'm comparing the other student grade palettes against during this student grade showdown, and why I have a tendency to be kind of harsh, because this palette has 58 colors. It's $30. Yes, it has a really weird shape, and it does take up a lot of desk space, and you don't get a whole lot of paint, but it handles really well, almost like a professional grade paint would, and it was a lot of fun to use. And then finally, I think these are kind of similar to the Shapiro Farben watercolors. Now these were kind of a dark horse because I did the Mia, the Shapiro Farben, and the Superior watercolors all kind of in the same batch, and I apologize if my pronunciation of the German is painful for you. It has been brought to my attention, so I will apologize every time. I took French, never German, sorry. But anyway, this was kind of a dark horse because I really did not like it during the unboxing swatch, and I ended up really liking it more than I expected to during the field test. So this one took me by surprise. So I really like this unusual plastic style palette. I say unusual, it's actually not that unusual. Like the Sakura Koi use this palette. There's a few brands that use this palette, but I see this style of palette far fewer times than I see this style of palette. Now these half pans, as you can see side by side, these are smaller than standard half pans, and they have this unusual cartridge system, kind of similar to Winsor & Newton's cartridge system. All of that is just extra plastic out there. You would not be able to refill this palette with, you know, half pan, like the Meeden half pans. You would have to basically clean out the paint when you were done with it and refill it from a tube. But that's not necessarily the hardest thing. I mean, you guys have seen my Super Grody Daily Driver watercolor palette. I just refill it from tubes. I don't even take them out of the half pans anymore. It came with 2 water brushes, which I think of the water brushes that I've reviewed, these are actually pretty decent quality. They are squeeze type water brushes. You get a small one and a large one, a small tube of white gouache. And this also came with a pad of paper, but the paper, I felt like the paper really did not do Shapiro Farben any justice whatsoever. And I have a field test for this that I'm going to share with you guys here, so hopefully you guys can see why I was impressed with the Shapiro Farben watercolors and why the field test kind of changed my mind. And here are some snippets from my Shapiro Farben field test. So this is one that did not do so well during the unbox and swatch and really surprised me during the field test. I really wasn't expecting a lot out of this palette because in the unbox and swatch, it showed that it would have a lot of optical brighteners, and I was really concerned that that would affect how the paint actually handles. And while it doesn't handle as well as the Superior or the Meliang palettes, and it doesn't handle as well as a professional grade palette either, it handles quite well for a student grade palette, far better than the Mia palette and better than I really expected it to handle. Plus, this palette has a lot of neat features, including loads of mixing space and a fairly compact design that makes it kind of stand out amongst the student grade watercolors. So between the Superior and the Shapiro Farben palettes, these are a tough act to beat, and I find myself comparing other palettes to these. So what are the pros and cons of the Artibox solid watercolors? The pros are there are a lot of bright colors similar to the Meliang and Superior palettes. And it's a serviceable, pretty standard metal palette with reusable half pans, and the half pans inside are a standard size. So the palette itself is a fine palette. It's just the watercolors that are kind of a miss for me. So what about the cons? These muddy the water really quickly, and muddy water often leads to muddy watercolors, and it can be indicative of the inclusion of optical brighteners to the point where they're really stretching out the paint, and you're gonna end up using a lot of paint to kind of get the saturation you want. And I've actually talked about optical brighteners a lot in several other videos and in a blog post, so I'll be sure to link those for you guys there so you guys can kind of understand why that's a hobby horse for me. And these are full of optical brighteners, like I just kind of implied, and these are kind of expensive for what they are and what they offer. There's a lot of other student grade in the $30 range watercolors on the market, and these are just kind of middle of the pack for me, which is not really where you want to be. What's my verdict on the Artibox solid watercolor kit? This kit comes with a pad of 12 sheets of cellulose watercolor paper, a water brush, the metal palette itself, and 48 half pans. These just feel very mediocre to me. There's many better, there's many worse, and these are just kind of expensive to be ambiguous. This Showdown isn't an attempt to love every watercolor I review or hate every watercolor I review, but to develop a solid ranking of some of the many brands and rebrands and white labels that are available on Amazon and AliExpress. There are going to be a lot of middle ranking watercolors and a lot of D-tier palettes that really don't inspire much appreciation or resentment. Palettes that are just kind of there. And in my opinion, we don't need more art supplies like that. What we need is more hits or misses. We need more innovation and experimentation. And this is not that, and it's not trying to be that, and I think that's why I have a problem with it, because I have had the absolute pleasure of reviewing some that are just kind of weird and wonderful, and you can tell that that company is trying to be innovative while also producing decent watercolor paints. Superior, I'm looking at you. So sadly, as a standalone review, I know this commentary doesn't really help y'all much. So here's my verdict, pending to change after the field test. Skip these. They're unremarkable, and while somewhat serviceable, are expensive for what they do offer, and they're cheaper alternatives that perform better. So what did you guys think about the Artibox watercolors? Honestly, I was kind of disappointed. I had kind of high hopes for them, to be honest. I reviewed a fair number of Korean, Japanese, and Chinese watercolors, and there's been some that I love and some I don't really love. So I was really interested to try something kind of unusual and different to add to my art supplies from around the world collection. And these were just kind of very for me. They promised, I mean, they're designed in Singapore, so I was looking for something, I don't know, you know, just something that maybe represented a fine watercolor tradition, and these just are not it. These are kind of similar to the Cool Bank watercolors or to the Semi Art watercolors. They're better than the Semi Art watercolors, I'll give them that. But they really just didn't shine or stand out for me, especially compared to some of the other sub $40 student grade watercolors that we've reviewed here on the channel. I found the colors to be, while they're bright, they just don't have a lot of saturation or impact, and the color mixes are not particularly impressive either, especially when you compare them head to head with some of the other swatches that I've been doing as part of the student grade Showdown. So even though I do plan on doing a field test, and there might be some redemption for the Artibox watercolors, I really feel like I just can't recommend them, especially considering that there are just better watercolors at the same price point that I've reviewed for you guys that I hope you guys will check out instead. They're just a very meh. They're not so bad that I'm over here like, what? Like the Xylee W watercolors, and they're not so good that I'm singing their praises like the Rosa Galleria watercolors. They're just a very solid pass for me. So I hope you guys found this unboxing swatch review to be helpful, useful, and informative. Reviews like this one are only made possible thanks to the generosity of my amazing patrons on Patreon. Their names are going to follow in just a minute. They and my husband are the sponsors of this channel, and they are the ones who make these reviews possible. So I really appreciate their support. If you would like to join their hallowed ranks, you can do so for just $2 a month over at patreon.com/nettosoup, and your support not only gets you early access to reviews like this one, but it also gets you access to all sorts of goodies that I am making year round. So I hope you guys found today to be helpful, useful, and informative, and hopefully this will go towards helping you guys make art a habit. I hope you guys stay safe, happy, and healthy, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Bye guys!